At the heart of today's global revival culture, the stadium gatherings, miracle schools, prophetic networks, and supernatural lifestyles, lies a name most have never heard: William Branham. Though long dead, Branham's legacy lives on in the doctrines, practices, and personalities that define the New Apostolic Reformation. From declarations and impartations to dominion theology and personal prophecy, the architecture of the NAR rests on ground Branham helped to lay. Yet beneath the signs and wonders lies a troubling question. What kind of foundation was actually built? Branham claimed to be a prophet sent by God, a man visited by angels, given supernatural power, and entrusted with the end-time message to the church. Those who attended his meetings claimed to have seen miracles, secret revelations, and the uncanny ability to read the thoughts and intents of their hearts. But behind the stage lights and testimonies, Branham's history tells another story, one of theological confusion, hidden affiliations, failed prophecies, and shifting public personas. His early ministry leaned heavily on oneness Pentecostals and fringe evangelists. His teachings blurred the line between biblical truth and mystical speculation. William Branham is not a forgotten figure. In fact, he is revered by many leaders in today's prophetic and apostolic movements and has even been given the title God's General. From Paul Cain and Rick Joyner to Bill Heyman and countless others, Branham is named as a spiritual father, a trailblazer of the supernatural, and a prototype for the modern prophet. His language, his stagecraft, and his theology have shaped the modern revival culture, from Kansas City to Reading. His imprint is unmistakable. But what happens when a movement builds its future on a man whose foundation was never stable to begin with? In the early 1940s, one of the most captivating acts on the revival circuit featured a curious pairing, a child preacher and a reluctant prophet. Little David Walker, a boy evangelist with a golden voice and emotional appeal, would stir the crowd with music and stage tricks such as levitation, making the audience believe his ministry was supernatural. Then, William Branham, soft-spoken, trembling, eyes low, would take the stage, claim visions from angels, and perform acts of supernatural insight. Crowds flocked to this emotionally charged spectacle, and soon Branham's name began to circulate in Pentecostal magazines and tent revival flyers across the Midwest and South. But the man sharing the stage with little David had far more obscure and deeply problematic origins. Before the revivals, Branham had served as a bishop in the Pentecostal Baptist Church of God, a fringe sect founded by Roy E. Davis, a convicted felon and known white supremacist who once held leadership in the Klan. When Davis was exposed and later imprisoned, Branham tried unsuccessfully to hold the sect together. He would later refer to this church split in his 1945 religious tract. "I was not disobedient to the heavenly vision," though he carefully avoided naming Davis, acknowledging his criminal record, or mentioning his leadership in white supremacy. During this period, Branham began rebuilding his identity. The plain-speaking man who once aligned with Davis re-emerged with a carefully crafted persona, a humble Kentucky woodsman, poor and uneducated, raised without shoes, guided only by visions and divine encounters. Biographers and historians have since documented numerous inconsistencies in Branham's retelling of his early life. In effect, he began writing his own mythology, a kind of Pentecostal Huckleberry Finn, designed to charm rural audiences and shield himself from scrutiny. He eventually altered his birth year, changed details of his name, and recreated his childhood stories, transforming the bustling Casino River city of Jeffersonville into the backwoods of Kentucky. His breakout moment came in 1945 when he connected with W. E. Kidson, a oneness Pentecostal editor who published Branham's sermons and promoted his meetings. Promoted by powerful figures in the emerging United Pentecostal movement, Branham began touring extensively. His blend of prophecy, healing, and mysticism attracted thousands. Newspaper reports from the time describe multiple men carrying large cases of money from revival venues, a sign of the staggering financial power behind his ministry, even as Branham continued to present himself as a penniless prophet. This combination of strategic alliances, stagecraft, and myth-making allowed Branham to move from fringe obscurity into the national spotlight. Yet his teachings, affiliations, and ethical contradictions were never fully examined. only celebrated. From the poor and feeble attending the revivals to the leaders of the movement, all were more interested in the stage act Branham had created than in whether his doctrines were scripturally sound. By the late 1940s, William Branham was no longer a novelty on the revival circuit. He was a sensation. His meetings drew massive crowds, often overflowing into the streets. Branham was billed as a prophet, a healer, and a man sent from God to usher in a new spiritual age. Audiences arrived expecting miracles, and Branham delivered, or so it seemed. Carefully staged entrances, hushed tones, and supposed discernment of names and diseases written on so-called prayer cards set the tone. But beneath the dramatic atmosphere was a calculated system of emotional manipulation, recycled narratives, and unverifiable claims. One of the key features of Branham's revivals was his use of positive confession, a theological and psychological tactic that would later become central to the Word of Faith movement. Attendees were told to believe they were healed and to declare it out loud, regardless of how they felt. Confession was equated with faith. Doubt was considered a sin. Under the weight of expectation, social pressure, and the hype of the event, many claimed instant healings, only to later succumb to the very illnesses they had spoken away. Branham rarely followed up. Newspapers reported hundreds of people arriving on crutches and in stretchers, and leaving on those same crutches and stretchers. Reports began to surface that the same healing testimonies were appearing in multiple cities, sometimes with the same names, same conditions, and same dramatic delivery. Individuals who had been healed in one revival were presented as new miracles in another. These duplications weren't incidental. They appeared to be part of a performance cycle designed to maintain the illusion of consistent supernatural power. Branham also made dramatic claims of supernatural feats, including raising the dead. In a 1947 sermon, he declared, "A man that laid in the morgue, pronounced dead by 3 doctors when I went in, is driving a Pennsylvania locomotive tonight." The man in question was identified as Elijah Perry, a local railroad worker in Jeffersonville, Indiana. Branham's followers said Perry had died in his home and been revived through prayer. However, this story was quickly investigated and overturned. According to the Jeffersonville Evening News, no physician had ever declared Perry dead. His sister confirmed he had been gravely ill in 1939, but had gradually recovered. When questioned by reporters, Perry refused to give a public statement, and no medical documentation was ever produced. Since he was never in the morgue, his testimony would have been devastating for Branham. A telegram from the Winnipeg Tribune asked for basic facts: cause of death, name of the morgue, time of the event, but the newspaper could only respond, "We could not substantiate this reported phenomenon." As his fame spread, Branham's teachings began to shift. He preached less about Christ and more about himself, his angelic commission, his visions, his role in God's final plan. He spoke in cryptic language about dispensations, mysteries, and the serpent's seed, the racist doctrine that fueled hate groups of the era. While early Pentecostal preachers called sinners to repentance, Branham called audiences to recognize his authority. He was no longer just a preacher, he had become the message. This blend of hype, mysticism, and unchallenged authority would become the model for an entire generation of charismatic leaders, and it was only just beginning. In 1948, just as William Branham's national fame was surging, a new spiritual movement erupted from a Bible school in North Battleford, Saskatchewan. Known as the Latter Rain Movement, it began as a spontaneous outbreak of prophecy, laying on of hands, and charismatic fervor. But behind the scenes, its theology and methods were being shaped by a single dominant influence: William Branham. Although Branham never formally aligned himself with the Latter Rain organization, his imprint was everywhere. The movement adopted his practice of impartation through physical touch, his belief in ongoing prophetic revelation, and his vision of an end-time remnant who would demonstrate supernatural power before Christ's return. His concept of angelic visitations and personalized words of knowledge became standard fare in Latter Rain meetings. Even the idea of restoring apostles and prophets, a concept explicitly rejected by most traditional Pentecostal denominations, was lifted straight from Branham's stage theology. What began as parallel streams quickly merged. The Voice of Healing, a magazine and ministry network founded by Gordon Lindsay in 1948, was originally created for one purpose: to promote William Branham's ministry. In its very first issue, Lindsay stated that the publication existed to report on Branham's revivals and spread news of the supernatural outpouring associated with him. But as the healing revival gained momentum, the publication expanded to include other charismatic evangelists: Jack Coe, A. Allen, Oral Roberts, and many others, many of whom embraced variations of Branham's eschatology, impartation theology, and prophetic spectacle. For several years, the Voice of Healing served as the central platform uniting the healing revivalists with latter-rain leaders, forming a single prophetic current that spread across North America and into the developing world. Though the magazine eventually evolved beyond Branham, it never left his shadow. In the years that followed, the Voice of Healing would become the foundation for Christ for the Nations, one of the most influential institutions in modern charismatic education, ensuring that Branham's theological DNA would live on in the next generation of revivalists, missionaries, and supernatural ministries. Key figures in latter reign, including George Houghton, George Warnock, and Ern Baxter, who served as Branham's campaign manager, adapted Branham's scattered revelations into a systematic theology. Warnock's 1951 book, The Feast of Tabernacles, turned Branham's vague ideas about end-time glory into a full doctrine, that a perfected group of manifest sons of God would rise to global dominion before Christ's return as the so-called Joel's Army. Traditional Pentecostal denominations like the Assemblies of God quickly denounced latter-rain teachings as heretical. In 1949, they issued official statements rejecting the movement's emphasis on prophecy, impartations, and extra-biblical revelations. But by then, it was too late. Branham's theology had already been institutionalized, not through denominations, but through independent networks of apostles, prophets, and healing evangelists who believed they were birthing a new era. Branham never wore the latter-rain label, but his ideas powered the machine. He modeled the prophetic persona. Latter-rain gave it structure, language, and theological confidence. Together, they created a movement that would re-emerge decades later under a different name, the New Apostolic Reformation, but with the same DNA. As the healing revivals cooled in the late 1950s, a new concern gripped the charismatic world: how to maintain the supernatural momentum without losing doctrinal control. For many, the answer came not through revival tents, but through structures of authority and submission, discipleship, accountability, and spiritual covering. This next phase of charismatic development would carry Branham's influence into new organizational forms, tasks, particularly through the rise of apostolic networks. One of the key figures bridging these worlds was Ern Baxter, Branham's longtime campaign manager and public defender. For years, Baxter traveled alongside Branham, translating his mystical sermons into palatable theological language and helping manage his increasingly erratic schedule. Their partnership allowed Branham to gain credibility among a wider swath of revival leaders. Baxter would later go on to help pioneer the shepherding movement, bringing with him Branham's emphasis on prophetic authority, hierarchical order, and the perfecting of the saints. Meanwhile, one of Branham's most devoted admirers, T.L. Osborne, helped extend Branham's supernaturalism to the global stage. Known for his international crusades and polished delivery, Osborne became a key bridge between Branham's mystical ministry and the emerging prosperity gospel. But Osborne's devotion went far beyond admiration. He had fully embraced Branham's deity doctrine, the belief that Branham was not merely a prophet, but God veiled in human flesh as the most powerful manifestation of the Son of God. Shortly before his death, Branham declared that his manifestation as the Old Testament prophet Elijah was Jesus Christ for our day. At Branham's memorial service in 1966, held during a full Gospel Business Men's Fellowship International Convention, Osborne publicly declared this belief to a room filled with charismatic leaders. He did not speak in metaphor. Osborne said plainly that God came again in human flesh in Branham. What is most telling is not merely the statement, but the absence of public objection. No correction was issued, no clarification was demanded. None of the leaders of the emerging charismatic movement refuted the claim. Among Branham's circle, the idea that he had been a divine vessel, even deity incarnate, had been quietly accepted or at least passively affirmed. This reverence became a template for future prophetic leaders. Branham had claimed divine visitation, altered his biography, contradicted himself regularly, and yet was treated as untouchable. His legacy was not just a theology of signs and wonders, it was the creation of a spiritual aristocracy immune to scrutiny. That legacy would live on in the rising apostolic and prophetic networks that emerged from movements like shepherding and the FGBMFI. The shepherding movement, led by Derek Prince, Bob Mumford, Charles Simpson, and Don Basham, introduced formal language for these dynamics: submission to authority, covering, and discipleship. But the blueprint was already there in Branham's ministry: his angelic commission, his stage-managed revelations, and his insistence that revelation trumped institutions. What Branham modeled, others formalized. These networks redefined authority in the charismatic world. No longer did accountability flow through denominational structures or shared doctrinal standards. It now flowed through relationships, revelation, and rank, from apostles to prophets, from prophets to the people. And it was built on the unspoken assumption that a new breed of leaders had emerged, anointed by God to govern the church with direct insight from heaven. Though William Branham is best known for prophecy and healing, one of his most enduring and dangerous theological innovations was his doctrine of the spoken word. For Branham, words were not merely expressive, they were creative. When uttered with faith, they could change reality itself. He told stories of speaking squirrels into existence and even commanding the dead to rise, not by prayer, but by verbal decree. These were not rare exceptions, but part of a growing theology. Faith-filled speech activated divine power. This doctrine became central to his healing revivals. Attendees were not only encouraged to believe for healing, they were told to confess it out loud, to declare themselves healed as proof of faith. To admit symptoms was to admit unbelief. As a result, thousands claimed healings that never occurred, pressured by spiritual suggestion and social expectation. Many later died of the very illnesses they had spoken away, but the revival had already moved on. It was T.L. Osborne, Branham's disciple and global evangelist, who first popularized this theology on the international stage. Through massive crusades in Africa, Asia, and Latin America, Osborne preached that healing, salvation, and breakthrough could be claimed through spoken faith. His widely distributed materials taught believers to declare their healing, confess victory, and speak change into existence, echoing Branham's spoken word model, though with smoother delivery and broader appeal. But it was Kenneth Hagin who would later give this belief systematic form. Though Hagin claimed to receive his teachings through divine revelation, many of his core doctrines, including faith confessions, revelation knowledge, and words as containers of power, had already been modeled by Branham and disseminated by Osborne. Hagin took those charismatic intuitions and organized them into a repeatable theology, giving birth to what would become known as the Word of Faith movement. Later leaders like Kenneth Copeland, Fred Price, and Creflo Dollar would take these principles to global television audiences, turning Branham's stage theology into a lifestyle gospel. Throughout the 1960s and 70s, the Full Gospel Businessmen's Men's Fellowship International played a key role in spreading these teachings. In hotel ballrooms and convention halls, businessmen turned preachers taught one another how to speak prosperity into existence, declare financial breakthrough, and claim supernatural healing, all using the same basic formula pioneered under Branham's tent. The supernatural was no longer about waiting on God, it was about activating results through the right words. Branham had once stood alone on the platform, speaking things into existence as a man of power. Now, an entire movement had been trained to imitate him, not just his claims, but his methods. The theology of dominion by declaration had arrived, and it wasn't going away. By the 1980s, William Branham's name had faded from public memory, but his ministry model, emotional spectacle, prophetic mystery, and supernatural power was quietly being reborn. A new movement, dubbed the Third Wave, began spreading through charismatic circles. No longer confined to revival tents, This iteration came through house churches, informal worship, and contemporary music. But while the packaging had changed, the DNA had not. At the heart of the third wave was the belief that God was restoring supernatural power to everyday believers, a message first modeled by Branham, now rebranded for a new generation. At the center of this movement was John Wimber, founder of the Vineyard Church. Originally mentored by Chuck Smith of Calvary Chapel, Wimber inherited more than church growth strategies. He absorbed Smith's early openness to latter-rain ideals, including the expectation of end-time revival, widespread supernatural healing, and personal prophetic guidance. Though Calvary Chapel would later distance itself from such extremes, Smith's early flirtation with the healing revival stream left a lasting mark on Wimber's theology. Wimber's trajectory was further shaped by Lonnie Frisbee, the flamboyant evangelist often called the hippie preacher of the Jesus movement. During the early 1970s, Frisbee lived in Fort Lauderdale, where he was personally discipled by Don Basham, one of the founders of the emerging shepherding movement. Living in an apartment provided by shepherding leaders, Frisbee was exposed to the core teachings on spiritual authority, submission to covering, impartation through personal touch, and hierarchical relationships. Though Frisbee's mystic, nonconformist approach often clashed with their rigid discipline, and he would later drift from strict shepherding structures, the movement's imprint remained deep, especially in his belief that the anointing could be transmitted directly through prophetic figures. When Frisbee laid hands on Wimber's congregation in 1980, triggering mass spiritual manifestations, shaking, falling, speaking in tongues, it was not merely a spontaneous outpouring. It was the practical outworking of shepherding impartation theology fused with Branham-style supernaturalism. Wimber, initially skeptical, embraced this new power ministry model, permanently altering the Vineyard's trajectory and planting seeds for the global third wave. This atmosphere of emotional intensity and mystical power would later culminate in the Toronto Blessing, which broke out in 1994 at the Toronto Airport Vineyard Church under John and Carol Arnott. There, attendees collapsed, laughed uncontrollably, barked like animals, and staggered under spiritual power. It was billed as revival, a new wine of the Spirit. But for those with historical memory, it echoed the emotionally charged, mystically suggestive environments Branham had perfected decades earlier. Though Branham himself had not openly encouraged chaotic manifestations, he had normalized revival atmospheres where emotional volatility and divine encounter became indistinguishable. Meanwhile, the Kansas City prophets, including Bob Jones, Paul Cain, and Mike Bickle, resurrected Branham's model of prophetic elitism. Paul Cain, Branham's protege, was revered as a father figure among the Kansas City leaders. He prophesied the rise of Joel's Army, an end-time company of miracle workers, echoing the manifest sons of God theology Branham had popularized. Cain's mystical revelations, authoritarian pronouncements, and spiritual mystique closely mirrored Branham's methods, and his moral failures were similarly covered over rather than confronted. By the mid-1990s, Branham's influence had fully resurfaced, embedded in a new generation of prophets and apostles who modeled his emotional spectacle, his authoritarian revelation, and his blurred line between spiritual hunger and psychological manipulation. And in the city of Redding, California, the final stage was being set. Bethel Church was rising, ready to gather the fragments of Branham's legacy into one dominant global movement. By the early 2000s, charismatic Christianity had become a global force. Signs and wonders, personal prophecy, and supernatural encounters were no longer fringe phenomena, they were mainstream. And at the center of this revival surge stood Bethel Church in Redding, California, led by Bill Johnson. With its sleek music, youthful branding, and miracle-saturated language, Bethel seemed fresh. But under the surface, it was old theology wearing new clothes. What many viewed as innovation was, in truth, a full revival of William Branham's prophetic paradigm, refined, globalized, and uncritically embraced. Johnson's teaching draws heavily from latter rain doctrine, particularly the belief that God is raising up an end-time company of believers who will operate in unprecedented supernatural power. He often speaks of a generation without ceiling, echoing the manifest sons of God motif that believers will one day walk in the full stature of Christ before his return. Healing is no longer a gift, but a right. Prophecy is no longer rare, but expected. Miracles are not occasional, they are teachable, transferable, and activatable. Central to this vision is the Bethel School of Supernatural Ministry, a modern institutional echo of the impartation and deliverance seminars pioneered by Branham and Gordon Lindsay in the 1940s and 50s. During the Healing Revival, Lindsay organized mass training events where believers were taught how to lay hands on the sick, cast out demons, and move in supernatural gifts. Branham's meetings often included impartation lines and demonstrations of spiritual power, framed as transferable anointing. BSSM replicates this structure almost identically, training students through experiential ministry, prophetic activation, and hands-on impartation, with the expectation that supernatural power can be taught, transferred, and scaled. At Bethel, students are encouraged to take risks, speak prophetic words, interpret dreams, and heal the sick as a matter of daily practice. Branham's spoken word theology, once a singular spectacle on a revival stage, has now become curriculum. The environment of expectation, suggestibility, and spiritual hierarchy cultivated in Branham's era has been repackaged in Bethel's modern revival machine. Like Branham, Johnson claims to operate under a divine mandate, often citing heavenly visions and encounters as the basis for doctrine. Like the Kansas City prophets, Bethel leaders speak in riddles, elevate mystical experience over scripture, and treat correction as unbelief. And like the Word of Faith movement, they teach that believers can declare reality into alignment with heaven. At Bethel, latter-rain theology has been resurrected in full, complete with angelic visitations, impartations, prophetic elitism, and dominionist expectations. Yet its polished branding and global worship empire have obscured its origins. Most of its followers have never heard of William Branham, and yet their worldview, practices, and language are built on his foundation. This isn't simply the next step in revival history, it's the full realization of a system that began decades ago. The supernatural culture promoted by Bethel is not new. It is the full flowering of a system seeded by deception, nurtured through emotional manipulation, and structured around prophetic personalities who are never questioned. It began in a tent with William Branham. It has been institutionalized in a school with global reach, and it continues, louder, wealthier, and more influential than ever. All of which raises a very important question. When the power looks real, the passion feels sincere, and the words sound biblical, but the foundation is false, what spirit is really at work?
Przyjechałem na jakąś wycieczkę do kościoła Reading. Nie wszyscy może wiedzą, a i chciałbym nakreślić, dlaczego ten kościół jest taki ważny. To jest kościół w małym mieście wielkości gdzieś Wodzisławia Śląskiego wraz z dzielnicami. Może nawet Wodzisław jest większy. Ale jest to jeden z najbardziej wpływowych i znanych kościołów na świecie, z którego wyszły niesamowite płyty uwielbienia, niesamowite nauczanie. Jest to kościół, który od kilkunastu lat przeżywa stałe, ciągłe nawiedzenie Duchem Świętym i Jego obecnością ponadnaturalną.